Hi everyone, Tim the Plane Man here, and after the last video, last little session was about an hour or so ago, and I've done some messing around since then. So I did some research on the PixRacer and figured out what needs to be connected where, some of the settings. Okay, so the first thing is that Wi-Fi module that came out of the box with the PixRacer does need to be connected into those sockets at the top of the machine, and the 8 plugs, the 8 pins that are at the right hand end here actually need to be pushed all the way to the right. And I'll link to the page. The PixRacer documentation page is actually pretty clear. Those last 2 pins, you don't plug anything into them. So this Wi-Fi module, you see there's a solid red light on it. I haven't tested it yet, but that's where that needs to go. So the second part is connecting a receiver. So the big challenge with this was, in some respects, figuring out whether to use a standard PWM servo mode, basically, to connect the flight controller to the receiver, or to use one of the bus protocols like PPM, iBus, or SBus. PPM, iBus, or SBus are all a way to send multiple channels over basically a single wire. And PWM means you have to have, every channel has to have its own set of wires. This is how you probably set up fairly standard out-of-the-box gyros, where there's a little piece of wire that has to go from the elevator output on the receiver to the elevator input on the flight controller, and the aileron output on the receiver to the aileron output on the flight controller, and the rudder output on, so that you basically end up with this tangled web of wires. The PixRacer has that option. There is a way with these wires here to connect. I think there's a way, actually. I mean, the documentation is honestly not that clear about how that would work with PWM. But I'm looking at some of the older documentation, and the way that these individual wires come with the one plug connector that is pretty much built to be plugged into the signal wire of a servo socket, and that potentially could work if we could figure it out. And I was just looking at a video from Painless 360 where he just runs down the channel mappings on the. He's using a different pixel, but it seems like it potentially might work to plug. You would plug the first wire into the top plug for the ailerons, and the second wire in for the elevator, and the third wire for the throttle, and the fourth wire for the rudder. That might be one simple way to do it, but honestly I wanted to keep it even simpler. So what I do have is I have this FlySky FS X6B receiver, which is, as you can see, it's more or less designed for drones. It doesn't have any servo outputs on it at all. At first I thought these plugs here were just micro servo outputs, and there are connectors that come in the bag that do potentially enable. Well, there's one of them there, right? It's a tiny little. I think that's a JST 1mm pitch plug with 3 wires that comes out and basically has a standard DuPont style servo plug in it, or DuPont Futaba style servo plug in it. Well, that isn't a servo plug. It's just a way to get the signal out for, and if you look at it closely, these connectors here are actually labeled PPM, which is one of the single wire protocols. This one is labeled iBus, another different single wire protocol. Effectively, PPM is kind of open source, more or less. iBus is, I believe, FlySky's proprietary protocol, and there's another connector on the back here, and that's also labeled iBus, so I think maybe there's an option to have two separate iBus connectors. So what I did, I looked on the web page for the Pixracer, and you will see, and I will again in the link to that there's a fairly, I don't know, it's a little esoteric wiring diagram. I'm going to record the screen for this so that you can see what I'm looking at. Alright, so I'm recording the screen here. So this is the PixRacer wiring quick start at the Pix4 user guide page, and there's this diagram here, which is, I think, the simplest way to configure the connector. So although, you know, this is showing the naked board, you can pretty much, if you line that up, you can see here's your servo outputs on the right hand side. These guys, the 1 through 6. There's the output at the bottom for telemetry. There's your USB connector, and there's the ports, and that's where you can see, actually you can see the two X's there, where it says plug the Wi-Fi module into the first 8 holes, but not into XX, which means into the right hand 8 holes on that set of pinouts there. So that's fairly straightforward, and therefore the plug labeled on the plastic case that I have, and you don't see it on this naked board, but it's actually labeled RCIN. So that's got to be receiver or radio control in, I suppose, and it does make sense because it's actually fairly simple. See here, PPM or S-bus receiver. See, this is where, okay, the receiver is connected to 3 of these pinouts on this connector here. But what we have, as you can see, there's a beautiful cable that comes for that plug with a set of independent wires. And the nice part about it is the top wire, as you can see, is red, which matches the red wire on the diagram. And the second wire is white, which matches the white wire on the diagram. And the bottom wire is black. Now there's 2 other wires, green and orange. And for the purposes of connecting PPM or S-bus, that can be ignored. If I was going to use iBus, I would have to figure out what to do with the orange wire and the green wire, and I'm trying to keep it simple. I'm just not going to figure it out. So all I need to know is if I can connect the red wire to the receiver and the white wire to the receiver and the black wire to the receiver, we're good. So the receiver that I've got doesn't look like this. The receiver that I've got is this one here. It's the FlySky FS X6B. It doesn't even have servo connectors, but it has a port labeled PPM out, and it has this nice little cable here that goes to a servo output connector. So what I did was basically I just traced, you know, black is ground, red is power, yellow is signal, and that means that all I need to do is get the black from the receiver to the black from the flight controller, and the red from the receiver to the red on the flight controller, and the yellow from the receiver to the white, the signal wire, and Bob's your uncle. Well, what I happen to have was some little these little male connector wires that make the connection, because I want to do this without soldering. And here's what we have is these wires that came with the flight controller with the Pixracer, with the package, the M8N package, take that one single plug and provide female connectors. I'm going to disconnect the power so I can show you that. It's going to talk to me for a second, but I just want to disconnect the power so I can unplug things without
communication lost.
Okay, communication lost, telemetry lost. Okay, we're good. Things are actually, that's what we want to happen. So so the plug that came with the flight controller, these are little female sockets, and normally on a servo connector, there's 3 of these connected together, but they're actually designed to break. They're header pin connectors, and they're actually designed to break off. And so what they've done is they've just basically put one of these on each end of each wire to make it fairly easy to connect something in. So I've got this wire that has the male end of the same kind of connector, and I had a whole ribbon of them. Got a whole ribbon of these guys. Just happen to be lying around in my desk, and they're basically male to male, and all I need to do is strip off one wire at a time, and I've got a wire. So I picked a black wire, a white wire, and the next one that happened to come off was yellow, and yellow matches the yellow on this end, on the receiver end, so I thought, well, that's fine. And so all I did was basically I take the male end and plug it in here. Slid in quite cleanly before. Take the male end and slide that in here, and took the male end, and the same thing happens here. This is actually a servo connector, and it's basically 3 of those same sockets, but all together in one piece. Well, I just took this male connector here and slid it in to match the yellow wire, which is the signal wire. So I've got yellow signal to yellow signal to yellow signal to white, and that goes into the flight controller. I've got red, goes to red, goes to red, goes into the flight controller, and then black goes to black, goes to black. So it seems a little fragile. I think, you know, again, I want to avoid, my goal is to avoid any soldering, so what I'm just going to do is I'm just going to tape those together so that they don't come loose. Actually, they seems like they could pop out fairly easily. The wires get to be a little longer than I would like, but you know, they can be kind of rolled up and taped, or you know, I can use a little bit of wire twist ties to just clean that up. That's no problem, and I end up with far less wires than I would have if I had to use, you know, a whole mess of these guys going. I would have to have you know, 5 wires going to 5 different servo connector outputs on the flight controller. So that's quite interesting and quite straightforward. And this FlySky FS X6B receiver, there's some information online about how to find it and stuff like that, but I'll just quickly run through it because it was a little tricky to find, and it's actually not that difficult. The first thing is on the OpenTX radio, when you select on any OpenTX radio, but I'm obviously using the Jumper TI, it's important to select FlySky 2A as your type. When you select the multi-protocol, if you select FlySky 1 bind, select FlySky 2A, and then you don't need to worry about the subtype, it'll figure that out for itself. But the subtype is actually PWM iBus, and that works. So the binding is fairly straightforward. What you need to do is hold down this little bind button, and because it's getting power from the flight controller, so you don't need to worry about your ESC and your motor and all those kinds of things. Just for the setup purposes, all the power is actually coming from that black wire and that white wire. And so when I plug the USB cable into the flight controller, the radio receiver gets power. So what has to happen is it's a little awkward to do it with just two hands, because what you've got to do, but here's what I found, is, you know, the instructions say you've got to set your radio to bind mode first. You don't. What you have to do is press the bind button when you power on the receiver. So if you can hold that bind button down and plug in the USB to your computer to get it power, you let it go, the light will start to flash. Press and hold the bind button on your radio. Have it set up so it's ready to bind. Just press and hold the bind button. Binds almost instantaneously. It would do for me. And then after that, it was simply a question of, and I will move ground control into the window so you can see what I did. But then once that happened, the radio was bound. It's connected through these wires to this RCIN socket on the flight controller. Then I was able to come into the radio tab here on Q ground control and calibrate. Now I don't want to do it again because I did it before, but I'll tell you what happened. The first time I did it, when I didn't have it set up right, I think I didn't have the receiver bound. I thought everything seemed maybe like it might have been working, so I wanted to test. So I came in here and I clicked the calibrate button, and it said the radio has 0 channels. So it was talking, these cables were working, and the flight controller was talking to the receiver, but the receiver wasn't bound, so therefore what it returned back to Q ground control was 0 channels. Meant it wasn't bound. So I basically unplugged it, pressed the bind button, plug in the power, press bind on the receiver, on the transmitter, and you get a solid red light. And then the calibrate button will work, and it will calibrate, and it's actually fairly simple and straightforward to calibrate the channels on the Q ground control.